Welcome back to Train Signal. This is Elias Knaser and you're watching Service Updates and Fabric Updates. Well, as you're going to notice, we've built this great environment. Now it's time to figure out, well, how do we update everything? There are two phases or two stages to this lesson. We're going to first talk about how to manage Fabric servers and Fabric server updates, and then we're going to talk about, well, how do we manage service updates? So we created services and we deployed these virtual machines from these services. How do we update them? So the first portion or the first part of the lesson is going to essentially focus on WSUS, Windows Server Update Service. And for those of you that are watching this video at this stage of the game, you're probably seasoned administrators and you've done a WSUS deployment and installation many times. There's a few things to note. WSUS, as it relates to VMM and as we integrated with VMM, is only focused on updating essentially Fabric servers. So you're looking at your Hyper-V hosts, you're looking at your Hyper-V clusters. Those are essentially what it's focusing on, in addition to all the virtual machine manager server roles. So the management server, the library servers, you have your pre-execution environment, you have your WSUS servers. All of these come under the WSUS update engine as it's managed through VMM. So WSUS in this implementation is not going to focus on how to update the virtual machines within the templates. It's focusing strictly on the Fabric servers. That's important to note, especially if you're going to be taking the exam. There's a few other things that you need to know. Once added to VMM, WSUS should be managed through VMM and not through the WSUS console. That's important, especially if you're going to be taking the exam, but also in your day-to-day tasks. Once you integrate WSUS with VMM, you manage it through the VMM management console, not the WSUS console. Only administrators can manage the update server and synchronize updates. Delegated administrators can scan and remediate updates. Delegated administrators cannot modify or delete baselines created by other administrators or delegated administrators. They can obviously delete the ones that they've created, but not anything that's created by others. Ideally and best practices dictates that WSUS server should be on a dedicated server. However, you can install WSUS on your regular VMM server. If the VMM environment is a small environment, then you can get away with it. But if you have a large environment where VMM is managing a lot of services and virtual machines and hosts and clusters, then it's very much recommended that you isolate WSUS on its own remote dedicated server. Now, if you install WSUS on a dedicated server other than VMM, you have to install the WSUS console on the VMM management server. Now, you need to get a grasp on this. VMM issues the commands that it wants to execute on WSUS through the WSUS console, which means that WSUS console has to be present on the management server so that VMM can issue its commands through that console. However, you're not using that console, so you're not opening that console. But simply the installations and the frameworks and the APIs and all the hooks that VMM requires are presented to it when you install the WSUS console. So if the WSUS server is installed on the VMM server, then you have no problem because by default it's going to install the WSUS console. If WSUS server is on a dedicated server, then you install the WSUS console on the VMM management server so that you can then use those commands to go through that console. WSUS requirements. So all of these are going to be kind of seamless. As soon as you add the WSUS role, all of these will be selected, but I kind of wanted to give you an idea of some of the requirements. So you need a web server role, you need ASP.NET, Windows authentication, dynamic content compression, IIS6 management compatibility. All of those are going to be things that are going to be required. Also, when you install WSUS on the VMM server, you're going to want to restart the VMM service. If it's on a dedicated remote server, then you don't have a problem with that. Alright, in my environment, because it's a small environment and because we have a small footprint and this is for demo purposes only, we're going to install WSUS on the actual VMM server. So let's go ahead and log in there and start the installation. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to launch Server Manager, and under Roles and Features, click on Next. We're just going to go through the basic wizard here that you've seen 100 times, and if you scroll all the way to the end, you'll find that you have Windows Server Update Services here. We're just going to select the checkbox. And here's all the dependencies, or here are all the dependencies that we talked about earlier. So you have your ASP.NET, you have your web server. If you continue to scroll, you'll find everything that I mentioned during the presentation is essentially listed here. When you go through this, you're just going to simply add the features. Click on Next to continue. You can feel free to take a look at what other features it's adding here. Next when you're ready. Next one more time, and here's where you have the option of selecting your WID database, or if you want to connect it to a SQL database, then you can uncheck the WSUS services here, or you can uncheck, the WID database and select your database, and then you'll have the option through the wizard of connecting it to SQL. For now, I'm just going to stick with all the defaults. We're going to click on Next. You need a location where it's going to download the WSUS updates. I'm just going to stick this on the C drive in a WSUS directory. Next, some information on the configuration of the web server role. We're just going to click on Next to continue here. Again, everything from a roles perspective as far as IIS is concerned is automatically selected for me, so I'm just going to simply accept all the defaults. This is your summary and confirmation screen. We don't want to automatically restart the server, so I'm just going to go ahead and click Install to get started. Alright, so the role has been installed. We're going to go ahead and click on Close. And now that it's been installed from a roles perspective, there's a few other things from a post-installation perspective that we have to address. So up here, I'm going to simply click on this warning icon here, and then I'm going to launch the post-installation tasks. And after a few seconds, if you click on it again, you'll find that the configuration has completed for Windows Server updates on VMM01. At this point, this is the only thing that we want to do on the VMM server. Let's go ahead and switch over to our Virtual Machine Manager Management Console and finish the addition of the server onto VMM. In the VMM console, under the Fabric node, under the Servers node here, you'll find that you have this Update Server. If you right-click on it, drag down to where it says Add Update Server. Our update server name is VMM01. Now, from a TCP port perspective, you can obviously use port 80, that's the default port. However, I would recommend that you use the alternate port of 8530, which is essentially an alternate port for WSUS to communicate over. This will help you alleviate any kind of conflicts that could arise by sharing the same port, or if there's an attack on port 80. It just makes things a little more cleaner, so I like to use the alternate port. From a user account perspective, run as, we're just going to use the existing account that we've been using that has all the rights. I don't have it configured over SSL. I don't want to deal with certificates, but obviously for best practices, I would recommend that you do that. When you're ready, we're going to go ahead and click on Add. Whew, that's what I call an update. This took a while. Hopefully you got something done, maybe some other work, maybe play some Call of Duty, who knows. Anyway, once this is done, we're going to go ahead and close out of this job here. And you'll notice that our update WSUS server essentially has been, or our update server has now been connected into VMM. You'll find that, we have the agent is green here, so everything is running smoothly. Our synchronization was successful, so everything is great, right? So we have added this particular server. Now, in order for us to take a look at some of the properties, we're going to simply right-click on it. We're going to drag down here to where it says Properties. You'll find that there's not a lot of properties to modify within this implementation of WSUS. WSUS integrated with VMM should actually be called WSUS Lite, to be honest with you, because they've removed all of the scheduling capabilities out of WSUS. Now, the update server within VMM is an on-demand service, which means it's not going to go about and download those updates and automatically implement them or apply them the way you're familiar with it with a typical traditional WSUS server. Here, it's on demand. You literally have to go in and synchronize every time you want to, synchronize with Windows Update. You have to apply those patches when you're ready to deploy them. So it's very manual but automated at the same time. So what do you mean, Eli? Well, let me try to explain this a little further. The reason why we're using WSUS, or an update server, to update the Fabric servers, the infrastructure here, as opposed to doing it manually, because I've had a lot of customers that have asked, well, you know what, why do I really need that? I can do this manually, right? I'll just go to every Hyper-V host and run my updates. You could. Now, in a small environment, you can get away with it. In a larger environment, one of the reasons why you want to use an update server has to do with clustering. right? So because you have this notion of a cluster, so for instance, in my environment, I have 3 Hyper-V hosts, right? I got 3 of them. And every one of those Hyper-V hosts, because the underlying Hyper-V itself is a Windows operating system, which means the Hyper-V itself has to be updated before you can even apply any of the nested virtual machines or any of the virtual machines running on top, which is out of scope for the update server. The update server only deals with those infrastructure servers, whether it's Hyper-V or VMM. The advantage of doing this within a cluster is the fact that when you run the update server, you have the option, as I'm going to show you a little bit later here, to evacuate the virtual machines that are running on top of these hosts, evacuate them to the other members of the cluster, update this Hyper-V host, bring it, reboot it, whatever you need to do, bring it back online, then migrate those virtual machines onto another host, and so on and so forth. As a result, you're leveraging the cluster to your advantage by automating the process of evacuating these virtual machines, or maybe putting them in a saved state so that you can update the underlying hypervisor. Can you do that manually? Sure. Does the update server have any value? Absolutely. Does it automate certain aspects? Yes, but there's also still a large aspect of it that's manual just because of the nature of the host. Typically, these sensitive hosts, whether it's vSphere or anything else, we want to use update managers as much as possible, but we want to maintain some level of control. So let's go through these properties here real quick and see what it has to offer. Under the general here, you'll find that you have the name, you have the TCP port that it's currently running on, and you have allowed update server configuration changes. You can always disable that if you choose to do so. From a proxy perspective, I don't have any kind of proxy requirements in order for me to synchronize or get access to the internet. If you did, you probably want to set them up in here. From an update classifications perspective, you'll find that these are the classifications for which Windows or the update server is going to communicate with the Windows update service and try to download proper updates. You can always come in here, select whatever you need to, and deselect whatever you don't need to. Right now, it's only set for security updates, and also for critical updates. You might want to do the definitions. Obviously, you might want to do this for drivers. You might want to do this for applications. So you can essentially come in here and select what types of updates you want to synchronize. And similarly, you can do the same thing for the product families. So up there, you're selecting essentially the classifications, but now here you can drill down into the actual products that you want to select or synchronize updates for. So you'll see that you have a whole slew of these products that you can choose from here. And then the final one is languages. You can also select which languages you want to receive updates and synchronization as well with. I'm going to leave all of these at defaults for right now. We're not changing anything. Let's go ahead and click on cancel. Now that we've synchronized the Windows Update Service, now we have the option of creating a baseline. Now the baseline deals with what you want to compare your cluster, your host, your VMM infrastructure services against. We have to give them something to compare, what their current service pack levels, critical hotfixes, etc., what they currently have installed against something. That something happens to be the baseline. To create that, we're going to click here on the library. It is stored within the library, and if we scroll all the way down, you'll find that you have something called Update Catalog and Baselines. So if we expand that so that we can work in it a little bit, there's not much really to see or click on here. So you see, if I right click on it, I have the option of, again, synchronizing the update server or working in baselines. Now, out of the box, you have 2 baselines that are automatically created for you. While you can certainly use those and tweak them to your liking, to your advantage, my recommendation is for you to actually create your own baseline. But before we do that, you also want to take a look at what you have here from an update catalog perspective. This is going to show you essentially all of the hotfixes that it's downloaded, everything that's available for you right now within the catalog. Again, if you right click on here, you'll find that you very, very limited from an options perspective. So let's take a look at the baselines up here. So if I essentially click on create and drag down here to where it says baseline, we have the option of naming the baseline. What do we want to call this? Let's assume we were doing this for our Hyper-V hosts instead of anything else at this point. You can give it a description. We're going to click on next. At this point, you have to associate the updates with the baseline. Which updates do you want to measure your hosts against? Now this is where it becomes a little manual, because you're going to be presented with this library of hotfixes that can be relevant and irrelevant at the same time, because it's not providing you just those updates that you need for Hyper-V depending on the host. It's just essentially giving you a dump of what's out there, and you'll have to go through these security fixes, or in this case it's critical and security updates, but if you had others, you'll have to go through them and figure out which one applies for your environment. For instance, you're not going to apply Windows XP update to a Windows Server 2012, right? So what you want to do is essentially scroll and find those hotfixes, those critical updates that you know are going to be useful for your environment. Let's go ahead and expand the description here. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll find that there are security updates, for instance, for Windows Server 2012, which we know we might need. So I'm just going to select this. You also have the ability to filter. So if you knew, for instance, what the hotfix number was, you can put that in there, and it will narrow down to that particular hotfix or service pack, so that you can easily find it. So the filter here can be of use. Once you find what you're looking for, you can click on add, and that's what I mean by it's a little outdated manual process, because now I have to essentially look for those specific security hotfixes that I want to apply. So it's good and manual at the same time, but when you're dealing with hosts that are hosting a lot of virtual machines and critical systems, maybe it's not such a bad idea where you're doing these things manually. When you find what you're looking for, we're going to click on next, and here you have the option of saying, okay, well, what do you want to apply this against? Because I know I'm trying to build this for my Hyper-V, I'm just going to select my Hyper-V cluster, which will apply to all of my Hyper-V hosts here. Click on next, and then when I'm done, I'm essentially going to click on finish. Now, once you have a baseline, well, we need some way of applying that baseline, right? And that's where we're going to go back into the fabric here, and under the fabric you'll notice that you have essentially a button up here called compliance. Once you click on compliance and you select your cluster, let's make sure we have our cluster here selected, and let's go ahead and expand it here. You'll find that it's pending compliance. So essentially it is still trying to figure out if it's compliant or not. So let's help it a little bit. So when we click on scan here, you'll find that after a few seconds it actually applied that baseline that we just created against those hosts as soon as you initiated the scan, and found, okay, well, your hosts are all non-compliant. So if you right click up here at the cluster under the compliance view and you drag down to compliance properties, you'll find that every one of those hosts has that particular security update that we selected earlier, and you'll find that the Hyper-V baseline that we created is currently attached to this cluster, and it's finding that all of those hosts are currently non-compliant with this particular security update. Now, what if within your environment you know that a particular security hotfix, a particular security rollup pack, breaks something within the environment? Maybe it breaks an application, maybe there's a known bug, something. But you need a way to also not be, in non-compliant, especially if you have auditors that you need to satisfy. Well, how do you get the environment to say compliant so that you can run your reports, right? Or at least you can show them. Well, one really cool way of doing that would be to click on the compliant properties. Again, you can access the compliance properties either by clicking this button that I showed you, or right-clicking and going to compliance properties just as we did earlier. When you find that, for instance, for Hyper-V 03, let's say, or let's say that this particular security update for Hyper-V 03, we know that it causes issues. What you can do is you can click on the create button down here, and then you can give a justification as far as, well, what is the problem with this security hotfix, and then you can exempt it. You're creating an exemption for this security hotfix. For example, I don't know, this breaks the hypervisor. And let's go ahead and click on create. Now let's go ahead and click on OK. You'll notice how Hyper-V 03 now became compliant all of a sudden. So you created an exemption for this particular hotfix or security rollup pack that you've you know it could cause issues, you created a justification for how to get around it, and you found that as soon as you created that, voila, it made it in compliance. Now, obviously, if you wanted to remove that, go back into the compliance here, select it, and you can click on delete. Click back on OK. A few seconds later, after it has the option, or if you want to initiate this manually by clicking scan, again, it'll find it immediately in non-compliance. All right, so there's one more thing I want to show you here that I'm pretty sure you know and you probably figured out already, but just in case. And if you recall, when we were creating the baseline, we were presented with a large number of updates that were completely unrelated to what we're looking for. We know that this WSUS version, this update server, can only update Hyper-V hosts or VMM infrastructure servers. So what has Office got to do with anything? What does Windows 7 or Windows 8 have to do with anything? In order to limit the number of products that you're querying and downloading updates for, under the update server here, if you select the Fabric resources again, right-click on it, go down to Properties. Under Products, you can scroll here and essentially select or uncheck those products that you essentially don't want the synchronizer to synchronize, right? Synchronize any updates for. So for instance, all of the Office stuff, you can remove all of that. You can scroll down here all the way and find the Windows stuff, when the Windows 2000, Windows 7, Windows 8. You don't need any of that stuff. Maybe you just want the Windows 2012 stuff. So again, you can limit the amount of queries that the synchronization service is issuing to the Windows Update service in order to download those updates. So I just wanted to show you that, just in case you were overwhelmed with a number of hotfixes that it came back with as you were creating your baseline service or your baseline configuration. All right, so we've associated a baseline, we've scanned, and we figured that we have hosts that are out of compliance. Let's go back into the cluster here, and let's go back into the compliance. Now, I have non-compliant hosts. What do I need to do? Well, obviously, we have to remediate, right? So if I click on remediate, it's going to show you an option. It's essentially a job that it's about to run to remediate those hosts. But you'll find down here that you have several options to control how it's going to remediate those hosts. For instance, do not restart servers after remediation. From a cluster options perspective, allow remediation of clusters with nodes that are already in maintenance mode. So maybe you have certain hosts that you've already put in maintenance mode, and you want that remediation to apply against those hosts as well. You have the option of configuring Hyper-V to remediate in any one of two methods. It's either going to evacuate all the virtual machines off of a host and then using live migration and then apply the remediation as I showed you a little earlier on, or it's going to put the virtual machines that are on those hosts in a safe state, apply the remediation, make all the changes, reboot the host, whatever it needs to do, and then when it comes back up, it's going to restore those virtual machines from that saved state. So you have a lot of options here on how to control the remediation inside of your cluster, and this is one of the reasons why you're using this Windows Update server within VMM, is to have these types of controls that I've been telling you about. It's also because we want, and I'm going to click on cancel, you don't need to see how this remediates obviously, but it's also so that we can figure out what is in compliance versus what's out of compliance. This is an easy way of being able to query those servers. So if you were doing this manually, this is one of the things that you would lose. Sure, you can do this manually, but you don't have any consistent, easy way of figuring out, well, which hosts are within compliance versus which hosts are not in compliance against a certain set of security fixes that you want to deploy. So this is one of those reasons where the update server really, really shines. But that's enough about update server. I want to talk to you now about how to update a service. And to do that, let's go back to our presentation. I have one slide, real quick. There are two methods by which you can update a service. You can update the existing virtual machines that exist within that service, or you can deploy new virtual machines with the updated settings to replace the VM that's already part of that service. So two ways. Either you take the existing virtual machine, apply those fixes to it, bada bing, bada boom, you're done. Or you replace that virtual machine that's already part of that service with a new virtual machine that has all the updated settings. Now, the latter, the second option, you would probably use that when there is a major upgrade or a major replacement. Maybe you're changing the entire operating system. That would probably be a good idea to deploy a new virtual machine. Maybe it's a major service pack, because some service packs are great, but some service packs can also be updated on an existing virtual machine and they're going to function just fine. Other service packs can be large, can be significant, where there's a lot of changes, maybe new feature introductions. Well, that might merit the redeployment of the virtual machine to the service. But I just wanted you to be aware of the types of methods for updating a service that are available to you. Let's switch back to the management console and take a look at, well, where do I need to go in order to update the service? Updating a service is relatively straightforward. Once you're in the VMM management console, on the left, make sure you've selected VMM and templates. If you select your cluster up here and then switch the view from VM to services, once you've successfully deployed a service, then it's going to show up in here with all of its glory and interdependencies. In order for you to update it, you're going to select it. Once you do that, up on the ribbon, you're going to find that you have new options. For instance, you're going to click on Set Template. Well, this is where you have the option of either, updating that existing template or essentially switching it out, replacing it. So here you're just modify application settings for this service, so you're just modifying it. Or you can replace it altogether. Now, mind you, right now the release is new, so if you've created one that's updated, it would have maybe a version 1 or a version 2. You also have the option of just replacing the current template with an updated one. Obviously, if you change the version, let's just assume for giggles that this was a new version. We're going to click on OK. Click on Next, and you're presented with, specify the values for the template settings. What do you want to change essentially here? And then if you click on Next, you have the option of the method of update that you want to do. You're either applying those updates to the existing virtual machine, which is the easiest, smoothest way, nothing is changed, nothing is lost here, or you're switching out that virtual machine for another one. Now keep in mind, if you switch out, if you're deploying a new virtual machine as part of this service, if there's any data that resides on the current virtual machine that is required for the proper functioning of the VM or the application that's on it, you want to save that or back it up or isolate it somehow so that when you're deploying this new virtual machine, you have the ability of reconnecting or reapplying that data so that your application can function properly. Obviously, the easiest way of doing things is to apply the updates to an existing service. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes you're upgrading an operating system or applying a service pack that is a major upgrade. You'll have to take some, use some caution with how you're doing this. Make sure as you're updating, first, take a good backup of everything. But second, if there's any data specific to that VM, make sure that's backed up. We're not going to go through this. There's really nothing for us to update. I just wanted to show you how easy this would be. You can go click on Next here, and it would show you again what you're applying. I don't have anything that's modified, hence there's really nothing to see. But you have the option again of looking at what you're trying to apply and then clicking on Next and Finish, and it would go about updating this particular service. So again, updating a service is relatively easy. Most of the work you've done already, so it's just a matter of slipstreaming certain things in the right place. You're either updating an existing service or you are essentially swapping out the virtual machine with newer settings and an updated VHD in a lot of cases. That's all I had for this lesson. Let's quickly recap what we've learned. So we started off by talking about, well, how do we do updates within VMM? And we talked about the fact that WSUS is at front and center, essentially, at the heart of the update process. And that WSUS for VMM is a very light version of WSUS. So they've stripped out essentially most of the scheduling features of WSUS. And as a result, what you have from an update server as it relates to VMM is a very on-demand type of update. Now, the other thing that I also mentioned to you was that the update server only deals with the cluster, the Hyper-V host, and the VMM infrastructure roles like the library server, the actual management server, so on and so forth. We then moved on to talk a little bit about how to update a service, and I showed you that you have two ways of updating a service. You're either updating the service to the existing service, essentially just updating those settings, or you're swapping out the virtual machine for another virtual machine. And I want to make sure, and I want to stress the fact that you have to be careful not to lose data that is necessary for the proper functioning of that application. So if you're going to do an entire VM swap, make sure you have good backups and you know where the data is exactly in the structure so that you can replace it. Finally, I hope this lesson was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.